This morning, Bill Hilliard gave an excellent example of how really to do empirical research on these things. I haven't done much of that. I've been working from a more normative point of view with these issues for 25 years. And of course, I have incorporated all different kind of knowledge that I've come across. But basically, it's a normative approach. I'm going to talk about Hammarby Sjöstad from a SEPTID point of view. SEPTID is the American term for crime prevention for environmental design, and that is the most widely known term for this. And there is even an international organization called the SEPTID International Organization that do a lot of conferences and so on. So it's a rather well-established concept around the world, but it is used in different ways, and we have developed a special flavor of it, I think, in Scandinavia, and to some degree also in the Netherlands. So what is this SEPTID approach? As I said, it's crime prevention through environmental design. It's a way of thinking about cities. It's a way of thinking about space. It's a way of thinking about design, and also a way of thinking about the involvement of people who lives there or use the environment. And finally, when you have thought about all these kind of things, it's also a way of thinking about the hardware. But it's very important, at least from the Scandinavian approach, that you don't start with the hardware. The hardware can come in at the end of the thinking. And it is to enhance actual safety and the feeling of security and well-being also. And this morning we heard that the routine activity theory is not good enough. Per-Olof Wikström told us that it cannot explain why some people are becoming offenders and some people are not. But I still think that if we are going to look at the environment, we have to use that kind of theory. You can also say that Per-Olof Wikström, all the time I have known him, and I talked to him for the first time 20 years ago, he has almost only been interested in the offender, and he hasn't really gone into real detail with the other aspects of this problem, especially about space as a lack of control. But you can say that in this kind of triangle here, you need to have a combination in time of a potential motivated offender, an object that is interesting for this offender. It could be a thing or a person that is accessible, and you have to have a space with lack of control. And that lack of control is many different things. It could be guards, police, it could be more informal, but it could also just be that maybe you will be observed by somebody. So it's when you have a combination of this that the things that we don't want to happen can happen, and if you just make one of them not work, then the crime will not happen. So, and this is not a thing that is predetermined. You can say it's a statistical thing. It's about probability. This is the US version of the SEPTID principles. I found it on the internet when I was here a month ago and was preparing the lecture, and it has target hardening in the middle. And then you can see it's about formalized surveillance, access control, defensible space, but it's also about natural surveillance, territoriality, and activity programs. This is the American version, and if you're not very careful, you end up with gated communities. In the US, there are more than 15 million people living in gated communities. And this is not what we want. And already 25 years ago, when we developed the Scandinavian flavor of this, we said we don't want gated communities. So what should we do? So our special flavor of this starts out from the movement network layout. We want integrated spatial networks, just like Bill Hilliard talked about this morning. We want spatial overview and visible people where it is needed. not everywhere, but where it is needed. We want distinction between private and public spaces, between fronts and backs of buildings and areas. And then, when you have thought about these three things, you can start to think about barriers. Well, there are different kind of barriers also. There are symbolic barriers, and then there are real physical barriers. And you need to have these in the right places. And it's better if you have them as far away from the public space as possible, so to speak. You shouldn't start with the physical barriers. You should start with the softer things. Then you need a functional mix for populated spaces throughout the day, and you need built density for populated spaces, and that might also lead to that you want to build more dense in the area you already have by complementary buildings. And then when you thought about all these urban planning issues, then you also have to, of course, to think about the buildings and the indoor spaces, so that safety also are considered in them. But that again is a later thing to think about. The urban spatial things is where you have to start. So Hammarby Sjöstad, it's a new city serviced by a new tramway in Stockholm. It's made up of streets and blocks like a traditional city to a large degree. And it's been under construction since the late 1990s. It has a functional mix with shops and restaurants along the main street. And I think the functional mix is done in such a way that you have these service things in the right locations. There are a few exceptions that doesn't work, but mainly it does. When it is finished in maybe 5 years from now, it will consist of 8,000 dwellings, between 15,000 and 20,000 residents, and there are 8,000 places of work. Consider it to be a new area outside the actual inner parts of Stockholm. It is rather populated streets and walks compared with rather dense suburban areas further out, and it is rich in services and recreational places. How has SEPTI then developed in Stockholm? Actually, if I should have given you some scientific evidence of if this is working or not, I should have talked about another area, which is Arvinge in Kista to the north of Stockholm, which is on the picture on the upper left. It was planned in the 90s with the police SEPTI principles, the Swedish police SEPTI principles that later became these guidelines for good housing areas. It's called Bo Tryggt 05 here. And there is one police officer who'd done his degree at the criminology at Stockholm University who has studied this in detail. There are very little crime, and contrary to what you might expect in an area which is with rented housing, there is no correlation, or you can say that you can eliminate the social factor. He's been able to do that and show that the physical environment actually is the explanation for the very low level of crime here. If you just go over on the other side of the street in an area from the 1970s, there is a lot more crime, even if it's in a situation where you have cooperative dwellings with a higher income group living there, just across the street. So here in the rented part, the crime rate is lower. And the only explanation could be the different physical environment. In the city of Stockholm, they have had crime prevention goals in urban planning since 1997. It is mentioned in their master plan that there is a document on this. I have asked for it at the city planning department and they cannot find it. So you can say, what an influence can you have from a document you cannot find? But now there is a growing interest in the city of Stockholm to make it a world-class safe city, and the social department, not the planning department, but the social department of the city now has a program for crime prevention, which have some focus also on planning issues, but it's still very, very general. In Hammarby Sjöstad, there was also a seminar on these SEPTI issues in 1998, where I was the main speaker. So maybe I have had some kind of influence on this. But I think that the main results of this SEPTI thing in Hammarby Sjöstad are mainly indirect. It is because that the chief planner there, he had the idea of building the traditional city of streets and blocks. And that is what has guided his thinking, and not the septic thinking per se. So some was thinking also a little bit of this, but it was mainly the other more general urban approach of street, kind of gridded street layouts and blocks. There are, though, some compromise with the kind of modernistic open space thinking, so there is also kind of modernistic configuration as well in it, but it is very carefully with detailed design at all scales. You have to understand also that Stockholm city planning is rather unique. It is not just Hammarby Sjöstad, but since at least since the early 1950s, Stockholm is a world-class example of urban planning and urban design. It's part of the reason is that the city have owned all the major land for development. They have developed quality programs for the urban environment, and they have a long tradition of a very qualified staff at the town planning office here. And they worked in close cooperation with developers and building architects and used a lot of architectural competitions. So there is a rich tradition in the city of taking care of the built environment. They did some disasters in the 60s and early 70s anyhow, but that's another issue. We could have another conference on that. Stockholm, the city of Stockholm proper, we're not talking about local government around it, but the city of Stockholm proper reached the limit reached the city limits in the 1980s, and the major possibility today to have more inhabitants in the city is to densify what you already have, and especially to redevelop the areas, the harbor areas, the old industrial areas that are in a ring around the inner parts of the city. So all the red areas here on this map are where the development of the last 10 or 12 years have taken place, and where the development for the next 15 to 20 years will take place, the major part of it. And also Hammarby Sjöstad. Hammarby Sjöstad is not in the Stockholm example of septic planning, as you can understand from before, but it is the most important Stockholm example of making an ecologically sustainable demonstration project. So there's been a lot of focus on that. Hammarby Sjöstad was an industrial area before, partly also a harbor area, but mainly an industrial area. So you can see that on the picture on the left. And on the right, you can see how it was about 2 or 3 years ago. And who lives there then? We also heard this morning that it is important who lives where in relation to what crimes are committed and fear of crime and things like this. You can have many different kinds of statistics and look at that, and I found a more kind of commercial analysis on lifestyles in Stockholm, and the green area, which is marked with A, are well-educated cosmopolitan people, and they are now spreading from the inner city out to just to the fringe of the inner city, and Hammarby Sjöstad is part of that. And just to say something which is quite different is the areas where you have a lot of immigrants. It's the light violet areas which are marked with an F. And if you go into a lot of details about what their lifestyles is about, you can say that there are very, very big differences in what is actually people's focus and so on. So it is rather rich and well-educated people that live there. There are very expensive dwellings also in Stockholm regional context. So now I'm going to say a few words about actually the physical environment there. It is built in such a way that you have a very good natural surveillance. You can see your car from your window when it is parked in the street. You have entrances with a lot of glass. You can see what happens outside and inside. You have balconies also with fronts of glass, so and windows from almost from the floor to the ceiling. So you have very good contact between inside and outside. in this way. And it's even for one of the few new examples I have found where you can look into a supermarket from the street, as you can see in the building on the right side and below. So the possibilities for natural surveillance here are very good. And then there are a lot of good detailing about the marking of territories, keeping the distance to the facade, subtle change of levels that makes a kind of shift of the kind of area you are in, coming up with some kind of subtle signals that now you are actually changing from being in one place to being in another place where you the way you have to change your behavior maybe a little bit and so on. There's also private gardens, where you can look into the private gardens, not just look into the balconies, but also into the gardens. So this is a kind of defensible space in a very kind of soft interpretation of it. And then there is, of course, this public transportation with the tram, which is a kind of central spine in the development. And all the tram stops have environment with very visible sheds where you can be protected from the weather, with benches and good lighting and waste paper baskets and generally good overview and so on. So that works reasonably well. There are still many vandalism things occurring, and especially people working with public transport, they are very keen on telling the police every little incident of that. So that's one of the reasons why this shows up, even though there is almost no vandalism to see. I've been into this area once every year since they started to build it, and I have 3,000 photographs, and I think I have 5 with graffiti on them. And I've been looking also for the bad things and not just for the good things. So it's an area with very little vandalism. Another thing that you also have to think about is where you place these automatic teller machines, or we call them bankomats, where you can get the money from the machines. And there's in the central part of Hammarby Sjöstad, there is only one of these machines in the street, and it's the one you can see in the upper right corner. And they should be placed in places where there are many people passing by, so that there will be some surveillance of it. But it's also important that you have dwellings across the street on the other side, that from these dwellings that you can see what is happening. And there's a big roof on top of the tram stop there, which actually takes some of this possibility for surveillance away. That's not so good, but it could be much worse than it is. Bicycle parking issues are also very important. There are a lot of bicycle thefts in this area, and it's very general in Scandinavia that you have a lot of bicycle thefts. It's important that you take care of your bicycles and you can park them in a safe way. You can lock not just the wheel, but you can lock the whole bike to some strong things. Or you have to have special rooms for the bicycles, but they are very often too small and too crowded, as you can see on the upper right corner. So some people anyhow put their bicycles on the balcony. Some of these bicycles cost something like 1,000 euros or 10,000 Swedish krona or something like that. So they have done something about the bikes, but I think not enough. And then we have the issues of parking. And this is an area where people are supposed not to have very many cars. There are only 0.5 parking places per dwelling in the area. And that includes also parking for people working there. They also have a carpool, so to have a better environmental approach to using the cars. There are 2 types of garages there. There are one type of garage that is like the one on the left hand, which are a kind of public garages, but where you also have private parking. You cannot enter there as a pedestrian. You have to have the car. You drive the car towards the gates there, and then the gates open up and you can go in with your car and pay the ticket, and then you can get out. And you cannot get in as a pedestrian unless you have your ticket and put it in a machine. And it's with a lot of glass and good surveillance and CCTV cameras and things like that. But there's still car crimes happening here, especially theft from cars. And there are 200 cars, I think, in that garage there. And there's another one which is much worse, but I haven't been into. But I can see from the statistics. And then there are private dwelling garages, like the one on the left side. And there are between 25 and 50 cars in those. And they are only for the residents. And they are safer. And there are almost no theft of cars there, but there are still some theft from cars, but not as many. And then technical systems are improving. This is one of the latest blocks that have been finished, and they now have both entry phone and electronic key systems. And this, I think, reduces crime even more, especially crimes related to storage rooms and bicycle parking rooms and things like that. In general, burglary of the dwelling themselves are very few. I'll come back to that. And also good lighting, of course, is important. And I think in general the lighting is good here, and there's a proper lighting to the different kind of spaces that is there. And also all this glass in the rooms of the dwellings also give light to the area during the night. So this is the route we are going to walk here in about an hour's time or so. We will start at the left, where the red line starts at the left there, and we'll follow this route. We will not go into the courtyard to the right, but to the left instead. But this is the route we will walk, and it will take about an hour. And we will divide it into two groups. Jan Landström, who is the chief crime prevention officer in the local government area of Nacka, which is bordering to Hammarby Sjöstad. He will help me so that we can take about 25 of you each and walk around. And when we come to the middle of the route there, we will change. Okay. So this is the excursion route, and it is through the oldest part of Hammarby Sjöstad, the one that now have, you can say that the statistics we have and so on, and have become stabilized. In other areas also knew that if we look into the crime statistics, that we have still areas that are under construction and so on. So these are the crimes in 2008. I've got this from Vanya. And these are from the geographic information system. So if there is a crime, if there are two crimes on the same address, they are stars on top of each other. So you cannot actually figure out how many crimes are there here. For instance, there is one spot in the gray area, in the low part of the gray area to the right. There is just one star. It's a petrol station. And in 1 year, there is about 50 thefts of petrol there. So there should actually be 50 stars on top of each other. Okay, but it shows a little bit of what is going on there. The gray areas are the old industrial area, which is still there, and the light brown areas are the housing areas. And the major Fruithair Street is now mainly in the light brown areas, surrounded by new development on both sides. In 2008, there were about 1,000 crimes committed in this area here, about 300 in the old part and 700 in the new part. And then there were some with unknown address. And I've tried also to figure out the crimes per 100 meters of street to see how that looks. And that is 9.2 crime per year per 100 meter of street. And in the old part it is 8.4, and in the new part is 9.3. So it's almost the same. And even if there are many stars on this here, most of them are rather small crimes, you can say. I've selected a few here just to show you the difference between the 1,000 that is a total number and the real serious stuff. There is one outdoor rape in a year, There's one murder attempt, one case of serious violence, and there's only 4 burglaries of dwelling in the whole area in a year. And then there are some other things. There are maybe 15 robberies. Half of them are in the grey areas, in the industrial areas, where there are some establishment that attracts possibilities of making robberies. And then if you look at the kind of crimes that is there is violence outdoor is very small, as you can see. Theft other than from motor vehicles is there's quite much of that, especially in the old part, in the industrial part. Theft from motor vehicles also important, and there are more of them in the new parts, in spite of the garage and the good visibility to the street for the street parking. There are almost very, very few robberies, as I said before. There are some motor vehicle theft. There are some drug offenses, but especially in the old part, there are some establishment that attracts people of that kind. Criminal damage and vandalism is also something you have to look at. It's almost the same in the new and the old part, and in the new part it is mainly in the tram stops, and also because all that is reported, and not all of the other things I think are reported. Burglary are more in the new part, but that includes burglary in shops also at the ground level, but also burglaries in storage rooms in the cellars. Bike theft, mostly in where people are living, as you can see. They are actually the largest percentage of all is bike theft, and then you have arsons and fire, which you cannot see. So that's it, and we'll start at Hammarby Allé, where you have average 869 pedestrians and bikes per hour at the most central corner, and the part of the street where you have new construction along it is about 1 kilometer, and the crime here per 100 meters of street was 11.0 in 2008. And then we're going to turn around the corner to a side street which is called Babelsgatan. And here the number of pedestrians and bikes per hour is reduced to 123 average. This street is 185 meters, and the number of crimes per 100 meters is almost the same as on the main street, 11.9. And then we go further on, we go across the water, across the little bridge, and we come to Sickla Kanalgatan, which is a dwelling street. That's almost the same number of pedestrians and bikes per hour, like Babelsgatan, 131, and they have only 6.0 crimes per 100 meters. It's a little bit more off center. Could be one possibility. Another one could be how I have counted the length of the street. That's another issue. And then we will go back to the bus through Lugnes Allé, which is the second of the main street in the area. It has at the most populated part, 941 pedestrians per hour. It has 21.1 crimes per 100 meters. So this is just some few things to say, and I'm almost finished. You will get a list from Vanya in the bus on what to look for in the area, so I will not read all these things to you, but most of them are all the things that are listed here, with the exception of the last one below, is things that you could look at. If this is the case, then it is probably a positive indicator for something. And then, of course, you can also look at negative indicators, which are the one in the bottom, general indicators of public disorder. But there's not much of that in Hammarby Sjöstad, like graffiti and tagging, broken glass, bike and car wrecks, other vandalism, grins in front of windows, barbed wire, blinded windows, free-floating garbage and poor maintenance, excessive fencing, locks and bolts. You will find very little of that in the area. And then there are special things you have to look for, which I have shown in the pictures, about car parking, about bike parking, about public transportation stops. There are also just 2 tunnels underneath the main bridge, and they are wide and light. And then you have also to think about safety consideration outside of bars and restaurants and discotheques. There are so many restaurants and cafes that 21 of them have outdoor services in the summertime. And then there's also the ATMs and so on. So I've used my 30 minutes. And I will end by saying that this kind of soft-sifted things that we are using in Scandinavia or want to use is in many ways the opposite of the modernist program of urban planning and architecture, which is the SIAM program, the Athens Charter of 1933, with Le Corbusier as the main author. When I did the first guideline in Denmark, which was finished in 1990, a couple of weeks after I've done it, I read the Athens Charter again, and it hit me that our guideline is a counter-manifesto to the modernist manifesto. It was not intended to be like that, but you can actually take point by point, and you will find out that the recommendations very often are the opposite of this modern manifesto. And I've later on looked into this manifesto. It has 95 major points. A few of them could maybe reduce crime a little bit if you have sports things for the young people and schools to attend to and things like that. It might help a little bit. But the vast majority of the guidance in this modernistic approach to urban planning from 1933 is things that if you're not very careful, it could be understood in such a way that it is actually counterproductive in relation to safety and a feeling of safety. So you can say that if you want to summarize very shortly, you can say that Scandinavian SIPTID really is more like the traditional city of streets and blocks than it is like the modernistic program. And this, of course, is a problem, because since the 1930s we have taught architects and urban planners in Scandinavia that modernism is the way. It is a way to work. It's been modified throughout the years, but it is still like that. That when we think about space and what is good space, as architects and planners, we very often think in the modernistic tradition still. And so to some degree, I think architects and urban planners cannot read what is in the guidelines because they have another paradigm in their head. So they're not actually actually able to understand what is there in the language because the paradigm is telling them something different. So these are two books in Swedish and Danish that I have contributed to in the last couple of years. You can read more about things that I have been working with on my homepage, and on the top of that is a list of literature on these issues in Danish and Swedish and English. Thank you very much.